Well, thank you, Stephen. It's not often that I chair Faith in Business Monthly, but I'm grateful to Peter Haslam, for inviting me to do so on this occasion. The subject, great to goodness, investing in kingdom excellence, is one that fascinates me and is dear to my heart. Do you realize that the kingdom of God is the central or dominant idea in the teaching of Jesus? Actually, that's not quite true of Jesus in the Gospel of John, but it's certainly true of the Jesus we meet in the so-called synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It almost resembles a corporate catchphrase. Your kingdom come is like a strapline that runs through everything Jesus said and did. Yes, the kingdom is a key idea, but Jesus never defined precisely what he meant by it. He tells us what the kingdom is like rather than what the kingdom is. His favorite device when teaching about the kingdom is to tell a parable about it. Matthew 13, for instance, contains no less than 7 parables which illustrate different aspects of the kingdom. And some of these have a strong investment feel, the image of the hidden treasure, for instance, or the pearl of great price. The implication is that prioritizing the kingdom is a good investment. So too, one of Jesus's most famous sayings, seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all these things shall be added unto you. The good things being material things like food and clothing that we need on earth. But despite the centrality of the kingdom of God in Jesus' teaching, it has been rather neglected for much of church history. The 19th century theologian Alfred Loisy made a fascinating statement. Jesus proclaimed the kingdom, it was the church that came. Just think about that for a moment. This is not to say that the church was a mistake, but the church has often made the mistake of thinking about the kingdom as virtually the same as itself. What's increasingly recognized now is that the kingdom refers to something bigger and broader. It speaks of that positive activity of God in the world, which includes the church, but is much wider and deeper. And we believe that activity of God in the world includes the sphere of business. It's interesting that a generation ago, there were quite a few Christian business people talking about their company as a Christian business. But that begs a host of questions, not least the question whether you employ only Christians, and that becomes increasingly problematic if your company grows in size. Instead, many Christian business owners are feeling more comfortable these days with the idea of a kingdom business. You may describe your own business as a kingdom business. Well, hopefully Phil and Terry today will help to shed light on what that might mean. So that's enough from me, and let me now introduce our 2 speakers. Professor Terry Young worked in optical communications, becoming a divisional manager and then a business development director. As a professor at Brunel University, London, he taught project management, information systems and e-business, and he led research in healthcare. He's currently director of Datchet Consulting, which supports organizations operating at the interface of business, healthcare, and academia. And then Phil Hanson is an engineer. He started his working life in the aircraft industry. After taking a break to do an MBA, he took a temporary job with IBM that lasted 30 years. And for the last 12 of those years, he was lead principal for IBM's manufacturing industry consulting practice. Since those days, Phil has been principal industrial fellow at the Institute for Manufacturing at Cambridge University and a special advisor for UNIDO for supply chain projects in Africa. He's also ordained in the Church of England. So I'm now going to ask Phil to start their presentation.
Well, Richard, thanks so much. and hello, everybody. The back story to this is that about 6 months ago, Terry and I, who, by the way, had never met, each independently approached Peter with some thoughts about exploring some things to do with kingdom purpose business. And Peter, recognizing some sort of overlap in these conversations, convened a three-way Zoom meeting and suggested that we might like to explore collaborating. And that's what we've been doing for the last 6 months. It was generously described earlier as research. That might be a slightly strong definition and perhaps a bit too ambitious, but we've been thinking together about some issues to do with Kingdom business. And today is an opportunity to share those thoughts with you. It is, quite honestly, a little bit premature. I think both of us feel it's a bit early. However, there's perhaps an advantage in that, because I think it gives you a chance to shape and form what we're doing if you feel so called to do. And well, our starting point was this: if there's such a thing as a Kingdom business, and I'm very conscious that not everybody thinks there is, and we've allowed ourselves to be gently agnostic about that for the moment. But if there's such a thing as a Kingdom business, then it will be recognized and we'll see it through either its Kingdom impact and its outcomes, or through its Kingdom behaviors, or hopefully both of those two things. And we were very struck, I think, by the work that we heard on an earlier one of these sessions from James Waters about the Kingdom impact framework. And I think he's doing some really, really interesting work in trying to understand and measure Kingdom impact. We're not looking at impact. We're looking really in this at Kingdom behaviors. Although at some stage it would be lovely to try and put those two things together and see if we can find some correlation, or even better still, cause and effect link between Kingdom behaviors and Kingdom impacts. But the particular question that we've been teasing around is essentially this: to what extent is a really well-run business already something of a platform for the Kingdom? Or are there areas where there are blind spots? Are there things where a well-run business falls short? Or even worse still, are there areas where so-called best practice might actually even contradict Kingdom behavior? And somehow or other, I think by examining the overlap or underlap between an excellent business and a Kingdom purpose business, let's call it that, we can begin to do two things. One is, I think we can begin to paint the picture on the box of what Kingdom business might look like in practical terms. And I think we all need that. It's a jolly difficult idea to get our heads around. And secondly, we might be able to begin to help business leaders to look at their own operations through a sort of critical Kingdom lens. And we've used this title today of Great to Goodness. I confess it's a slightly corny parody of the Jim Collins book that you'll probably all know, Good to Great. But we're trying to suggest that just maybe even being great might not be enough to have serious Kingdom impact. And maybe there's another step beyond. So let's just talk for a moment about business excellence. The theme of all these sessions this year in 2022 is investment. And I think business excellence, just as Kingdom, by the way, is an investment. So, we're not talking about financial investment, but we're definitely talking about an investment of effort. And there have been models of best practice and business excellence around for, goodness me, at least 25 years. There are hundreds of them, and many of them are sort of sector specific, and there's a few generic ones. But the two most prominent used around the world are, firstly, the European Foundation for Quality Management, the EFQM, which is used throughout Europe and most of Asia. And then there's the Malcolm Baldrige Award, which is used extensively and mainly in North America. And they're used by large companies and medium-sized companies and even small companies. I was, for some time, the chairman of governors of an FE college in the Midlands, and we used the EFQM to considerably good effect at a time when the processes in the college were really not necessarily their best. Well, these two approaches, they've been around for a long time, and over the years they've been around, they've gradually refined and improved their guidance on what makes an excellent business and what makes excellent business practice. And interestingly, both of them have something of an ethical thread running through them. They're not just about purely operational excellence. The vocabulary in that sense that they use is corporate and social responsibility, sustainability, financial probity, fair trade, human rights. There are all sorts of threads running through these. And the vision, interestingly, of EFQM is that if every company worked the way they describe, then the world would actually be a better place. And interestingly, that, I think that's a bit of a kingdom claim, isn't it? Well, what we've been trying to do is to create some sort of a framework where we can begin to look on one side at business excellence, on the other side at kingdom, and find a way of drawing meaningful comparisons and systematic comparisons between them. Now, and the chart you can see before you now, the EFQM and Baldrige highest level criteria I've mapped out there, and running through them, there are three particular threads: purpose, people and relationships, and processes. And they felt to us like a promising start point to start to explore kingdom, knowing that when we look at purpose, excuse me, we can unpack that word in business excellence terms by going back and looking at the very detailed criteria in EFQM and Baldrige. So we have a way of taking that and unpacking it in considerable detail simply by cascading back through these two models. And I think we have a sense that, we could have picked many other models of business excellence and they would similarly map. We haven't tried any others yet, but I'm fairly confident it won't be difficult to use these three particular focus points of purpose, people and relationships, and processes. So the challenge for us then was, if that looks promising, is there something on the other side of this where we can similarly unpack kingdom and start to exchange ideas between kingdom and business excellence? So I'm going to hand over to Terry just to talk about that aspect.
Thanks, Phil. I think that the challenge for us really was to come up with, first of all, a kingdom lens. And just like we've chosen arbitrarily, I suppose, a couple of very well-known business excellence lenses, we've chosen perhaps one of the most famous lenses into the sort of the virtues of the kingdom, faith, hope, and love, although they're not quite in that order on this slide for reasons that will become clear as we do it. So we've got some stuff on the left-hand side that we understand will be theologically loaded, and we've got some stuff on the right-hand side which is very oriented towards business excellence, and which Phil has, at least in a very quick way, unpacked. So those two cases on the right-hand side we understand, but what we really needed, and this was a trial and error activity, we really needed something that would allow us to have some words that sort of pivoted either way. And in the end, we came up with these three sets of R words. So there was realizing renewal, there was rewarding relationships, and there's resilient reliability. And in terms of purpose, realizing renewal has the idea of not just vision and strategy, which are deeply embedded in the business excellence model, but are also looking at the sort of the Christian ideas of hope and glory and promise, that sense of longing that we're meant for somewhere else and we can't really be fully satisfied here, that sense of creativity that's embedded in the creation mandate to go and multiply and to fill the earth. All of those ideas we're trying to capture in something that we'll call realizing renewal. Similarly, the relationship piece, rewarding relationships, that does refer on the one hand to people, and on the other hand, that links quite nicely to a theological idea of Christian love, of the yearning that we have for meaningful relationships, to love and to be loved in a meaningful way. And then finally, at the bottom, we've got something around resilience and reliability. We've called it resilient reliability, the idea that you can have stuff that really works and works well. And this is probably the piece where people may say, Terry, you've got this wrong, Phil, you've got this wrong. And we may have done, we don't know. That's one of the reasons why we're putting it up here for discussion at the moment. If we can accept that, and we'll unpack a little bit more in the next slide, but if we can accept that, then we can look sort of to the left and see something that's kingdom meaningful and something that has business meaningfulness on the right-hand side. And we've got the basics of some kind of a framework. And if we're fortunate, we'll be able to talk all the way through from hope to purpose in business, from Christian love to people, the way that they're handled in business, and from something to do with faith to the way that processes work in business. But there's a little bit of wrinkling to be untangled. And one of the problems is that there's at least two very different ideas that seem to be together in the idea of faith. And again, I'm not a theologian, and the theologians in the room, I think eventually we're going to have to sort of thrash this out. But I think there's at least the idea of trust. We talk about believing in Jesus, and we talk about believing Jesus. We talk about believing the message. There's an idea of trust, and we think of faith in that way. But there's also the idea of fidelity, of faithfulness, of things that are genuinely good, things that are genuinely lasting. So there's this idea of fidelity that is buried in the idea of faith. And so to make the framework work, what we've said is let's park the trust part of faith up in the love bit so that connects on to rewarding relationships. And let's focus in faith on the resilient reliability. And that leads us through, and we're trying to interpret that into business processes. And of course, most best practice business ideas are absolutely bonkers about process. Process is the one thing that you can measure and that you can make work. So there's a real emphasis on that. And so we've got something from faith, that thing that is thirsty for the perfection of God. We've got something about love, that part of us that is thirsty for the heart of God. And we've got something about hope, that's something which is thirsty for the glory of God. And you say, well, I don't like that relationship. I'd like to have something that's a bit different. I prefer the fruit of the Spirit, for instance. And so I think, just like when you buy a new camera, you can probably click more than one lens to the front of it. I suspect, and we're not there yet, but what we hope is that you can actually click on another set of lenses. So if you say, I'd like the fruit of the Spirit, I think probably this was some work I did a few years ago just to try and connect up the fruit of the Spirit to the themes of faith, hope, and love. I think you can probably put them together in groups like that so that you've got a different sort of lens. And ultimately, what we're hoping to get at is whatever your ethical lens on the left-hand side and whatever your preferred best practice lens on the right-hand side, there should be a way of having a dialogue and trying to work out where the differences and similarities are. I'm going to hand back to Phil now to begin to show you what sort of questions arise if we do that and how we can go about thinking about them. Phil.
Thanks, Terry. We're essentially very keen to keep this as practical as we can. And it would be lovely to talk through lots of questions, but we don't have time. So I'm going to pick two of the questions out just to explore them with you very briefly, just to give you a sense of how this works. So if we take the very first one, question one, business excellence paints a picture of purpose that is vigorously and well understood throughout the organization. It sits somewhere above vision and strategy. It has a very clear process of governance. The strategy is incredibly systematically executed, and it makes a particular virtue out of adaptability, the ability to shift the business according to changing circumstances. We've seen a lot of that during the pandemic, and we're seeing a lot of it. If you read today's financial press, you see an awful lot of companies now, because of what's happening in Ukraine, a huge amount of moving the business according to what's going on around us. Now, the challenge for business is what happens to the purpose during that process of adaptation. And when we look at purpose through the lens of hope, hope is essentially a constant. Hope doesn't change according to the data. Optimism changes according to the data, but hope doesn't. And the challenge for us is that if we are a kingdom purpose business, every time we adapt, unfortunately, the purpose tends to get dragged with us. You'll all have noticed Christian-founded charities which seem to fight a constant battle against creeping secularization. And this idea that actually purpose should be an absolute constant, and whatever we do to adapt our business, it really shouldn't change the purpose, is an emerging observation from looking at it through the lens of hope. So the question we've written here is this: making the business rapidly adaptable to changing circumstances, does that override kingdom purpose? Does it override? Does it spoil the overriding kingdom purpose? And I think that's a really challenging question for anybody who's setting out to be a kingdom purposed organization. If we take question 6, just another, I'm picking these only just to give an example. When we look at human resources in most companies, it's focused on recruitment, retention, training. Unfortunately, it's often focused on how to remove people from the business. And much of it is about policing employment law. It's about people as assets and resources. What it typically isn't about is rewarding relationships. And we were another earlier session in these faith and business sessions that Simon Barrington did, where they were seeking to work out how to measure working relationships, very much caught my imagination. And I think the question we're asking in this one is the energy going into employee well-being focused mainly on the areas of employment law, or is it really making steps towards building and nurturing human relationships? So you begin to see that what we're trying to do is to use the framework to test this vision of business excellence, but through the kingdom lens. And what we'd love to do is to leave you with three sort of thoughts for the syndicate groups, really. The first one is, does the whole idea of great to goodness make sense to you? Does it, because, we're all, I think, a little bit confused about whether there is or isn't something such as a kingdom business. Secondly, is there a way in which these ideas, can you imagine how they could be developed to be of practical help to you? Because that's really what our goal is to build something that's of lasting value to kingdom entrepreneurs and kingdom managers. And thirdly, does it strike you as being something where you might like to bring your own business to the table to begin to explore these ideas with us? Because I think this isn't so much going to be a pure piece of academic research as much as something which will be developed through engagement, I think. So we'd love to know if you're interested in collaborating in any way. That would be fantastic. So well, good luck. I hope this gives you something to chew on.
You're on mute, Richard.
Unmute, Richard.
Mute myself. I beg your pardon. I was just saying lots of very interesting and stimulating material there. Thank you so much to both Phil and Terry. If I might just chip in with one thought, the trio of love, faith, and hope we find, of course, in 1 Corinthians 13. And I've always been fascinated by the fact that Paul starts that chapter by saying, I will show you a more excellent way. He doesn't just say, I'll show you a better way. It's actually more excellent. So that really seems to tie in with what you've been talking about. Now, we've got some questions appearing in chat. So first of all, there was a question from Sue Halliday. Thank you, Sue. The Unilever challenge of delivering purpose and returns for shareholders has been in the business news recently. The charge, I think, is that purpose values has got in the way of excellence as defined by profits returns. Would you care to comment on Unilever from this angle? I don't know if you're aware of this debate that's been going on in that corporate circle.
And yeah, I'm not familiar with that particular debate, but if being a kingdom business sub-optimizes financial success, then that may well be the case.
And are you saying that may be a price to pay?
Yes.
Or that it should be possible to combine both?
Well, I think what we were trying to suggest here is that that business excellence and operational excellence is the foundation on which we're building, but it might not go far enough to meet kingdom impact. So we're not in any sense suggesting you should aim for any sub-optimization of operational or financial excellence at all. This is, that's why it's going from great to goodness. That was our concept, really.
Okay,
The other thing,
Sue, would you like to come back on that at all?
Yes. Well, I've been following Unilever just a little bit because it's been, there's a project going on at the Said Business School in Oxford about business purpose. And Unilever has been quite one of the sort of star players in this move to really focus on a business having societal purpose. And so I was just intrigued in the last numbers of weeks to read about Unilever being a possible target for takeover or stripping out, and they haven't been making enough profits, and this purpose thing has sort of been getting in the way. It seems to be the way that the business reporters have commented. Now, I haven't seen anything from the side business school. I've been a bit busy with a few other things myself. I haven't sort of got back in touch with any of those people to see what they're saying, but I just think it's interesting that it hasn't really had a good press. And it's been seen, this thing about purpose has been seen as a sort of unnecessary luxury that it can't afford in today's competitive environment.
Sue, good to see you. Sorry, can I just throw in a couple of things that came up? Phil and I have put together in a few minutes what's taken us many hours of agonizing conversation to push back and forth and say, do these pieces fit this way or not? And I think one of the things that we realized about purpose is that best practice tells you how to build a purpose. It tells you the processes, it tells you how to validate it, but it doesn't tell you how to know whether your purpose is a good purpose or a bad purpose, right? There's no way in which the rubric of best practice can tell you whether your purpose that you've selected is a good one or a bad one. It just says you need one, and then once you've got a purpose, then that drives your strategy and your leadership and other things. And I think that that's one of the things that we realized early on was the difference that actually there's a lot of purpose questions that best practice from a business perspective is incapable of fully addressing. And I think all we've done at the moment is to identify a mismatch. We haven't in any way sorted it out or solved it.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to our next question, which is from Jeffrey Guest. Jeffrey, I think it might be helpful if you articulated this for us.
Well, just going back to my days of Covey, begin with the end in mind, you always start with who benefits and what are the benefits. We need to define the benefits of what we're doing. So we're mixing our ethics with our practice. So our ethics must inform our practice. So what are our ethics? Who are our customers? Because a lot of companies these days seem to have as their customers their shareholders. The whole point of the business is to benefit the shareholders rather than the end customer. And there can be a conflict there. So it's a matter of who benefits is the question I usually ask. And to define what the benefit is.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Phil or Terry, would you like to comment on that?
I'm not sure where to start with that. We did spend a long time debating. One of the things you see in these excellence models is a huge focus on meeting the expectations or indeed exceeding the expectations of all stakeholders. And we spent a long time debating where is the voice of kingdom in the list of stakeholders. Because actually, the stakeholders are the customers and the collaborators and the suppliers and the employees and so on. But there isn't overtly a voice of kingdom in there. Where is God in the stakeholder list, basically? But the benefit is for mankind, I think, just to answer your other question.
Okay, Terry?
I think the whole question about value in business is really difficult because so much of it's intangible. So, where you can monetize it, it's quite easy to do, but where you're starting to deal with intangibles, and then it depends a little bit as to whether you're a utilitarian or a deontologist or how you fit those two things together. My simplistic way, and I'm not on top of either of those points of view, is that if you knew everything and could see forever, the two views probably converge. But I think that there are some real difficulties around how you build genuine value in. I mean, things like lean have made value streams a colloquialism, but what they haven't done is told you how you really work out what value is. And I think it's a tricky one. And I think that's why you'd like to see some kingdom values shining their light in from the left-hand side of our diagram to try and illuminate the right-hand side. Because I think not all of we're just talking about areas where business excellence really is incapable of articulating a consistent view, in my view.
Okay, thank you. We've got a comment from Andrew Gilbert, though I think he might now have left us. There seem to be several people who need to leave early, but he says, I think we can both gain and lose hope. It's not always constant. So I think he's questioning what you said there, Phil.
Okay.
So come back on that.
Well, I was trying to draw the distinction between optimism, which, when you think about all those days we spent listening to COVID statistics, optimism goes up and down according to the data, but fundamental Christian hope ought to be independent of those vagaries of the data.
Yeah, that is a distinction a lot of people are making these days, I think, between hope and optimism, which is helpful. But optimism seems to be much more dependent on circumstances. Hope is something deeper. A question from K.O. Chia from Hong Kong. Where do you place servant leadership in the model? That's a good question. Terry, would you like to have a go at this one?
So one of the discussions that Phil and I had was how a business excellence model allows the leader to be a servant, because the leader's time is normally valued at some extortionate amount of money per hour or whatever, and it's bad use of the company's money to be spending that with, say, the least important person in the business or the most helpless person. And so there's a sense in which the value that is imputed to leaders because of a financial structure in which they operate makes it quite hard to make the sort of servant leadership decision. So again, I mean, everybody's pouncing on the difficult questions. Yeah, they're there, they're difficult. We haven't solved them. We've just started to say, at least we can have a dialogue about some of those questions. We have a framework in which to have that dialogue. But no, these are really important issues. We've started to talk about them, but we haven't answered them. Phil.
Yeah, in defense of the business excellence models, they paint a picture of empowerment as something which it's an atmosphere you create through a sort of shared vision and a large amount of trust. And empowerment isn't something you give, it's something that people take because they feel secure in taking it. And an empowered workforce, which is clear in its vision, taking responsibilities on its own initiative, is not so massively different from the vision of servant leadership, to be honest with you.
Okay, the questions are piling in now, but I think we've only got time for one more before our breakout group. So Val, would you like to pose your question?
Yes, I'm interested to know what your observations are between the SME world and the corporate world. Do the same rules apply?
Well, Terry and I had a long debate about cash flow, which is one of the things that bedevils small and medium-sized companies. And good practice in cash flow is paying your own bills as late as you can and getting the money in as quickly as you can, which is deeply unhelpful to all of your other collaborators and stakeholders. So, cash flow was one of the areas where there is the potential for so-called best practice to be a little contradictory to Kingdom, for example, and that came out of thinking how this applied in SMEs, for example. But I'm sure there are differences. I can only rest on the fact that this is fairly early days for us, and I don't think we've bottled all of those thoughts yet.
I think the other point that Phil has been quite passionate about is the fact that if you're running an SME, you probably have a lot of influence over the organization that you're running. If you are part of a very large organization, you have much less influence over the values and the systems that go on there. And so you've got this question about, can I sort of create a kingdom island within this much bigger organization, and what might that look like? So now everybody's pointing out the really difficult bits. We haven't answered those yet. We've just put a couple of planks across, but we haven't built a bridge yet. But I think that there's some really interesting stuff here, and I think that the questions that are coming up are showing how important and interesting it is. So thank you.